Okay, so final part of crime is looking at victimology. What it is to be a victim, how do we define that, and what can we do, or how do the perspectives look at why people are more likely to be victims of crime than others? So difference between positivism and interpretivism is interesting here. We start to look at the perspectives. So positivists focus on the institutions in society. Do they play a role in creating victims? And the interpretivist is looking at the individual. Do they, again, this is quite victim blaming, do they put themselves in situations which make them more likely to be a victim? And also, how do we know that they are not also the perpetrator, which I'll come on to in a second. So positivist and interpretivist, society and individual. So defining what a victim is, and again, we have the issue where the word victim is kind of being phased out towards survivor. The UN defines victims of crime as somebody who has suffered harm, physical or mental injury, suffering emotionally, loss of money, impairment on their rights through acts of omissions that are in violation of criminal laws. So it encompasses a whole variety of crime there. Physical, emotional, economic, their rights being violated, so a bit of state crime, human rights being infringed, and collectively suffering from a form of harm. But like I just said, it's criticised because we don't always know who the victim is and who is the offender. And it's very easy to get entangled if we think about any famous cases where like Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, they were both putting themselves forward as being victims of crime, but equally had parts to play, had a role to play in sort of like the relationship downfall. So positivist victimology, again, this is quite criminological. Oh, is that a word? Let's go with no. That's more criminology based. Mears puts forward this idea or wants to look at factors that produce patterns. So the focus is on the interpersonal crime of violence. So focusing more on like GBH and assault. And identifying victims who've contributed to their own victimization. Now already we should have alarm bells ringing for AO3. This is very victim blaming. It can be interesting, not victim blaming, but it can be interesting to talk about patterns and interpersonal crime. Hoyle pointing out that the identification of patterns has meant that through things like victim surveys, which we know are forms of self-report, where people talk about or they report on if they've been a victim of crime or committed crime. And he says this can help us in a number of ways. So it can help us because some people may have not gone to the police. So it helps us identify victims. It allows us to do more in-depth and local studies. We can get that data out, get that questionnaire to a wide variety of people all across the country. And it gives us the possibility to produce data on the experience of crime and the effects that has had on those involved. So the repercussions, the consequences of a crime. And then something can be done in terms of victim support to help us know what needs to be done to help people who have been victims of crime. Now, our crime survey of England and Wales has found a number of factors that link to the chances of being a victim. We've discussed a few of these already. We've looked at age and ethnicity. Young men, 16 to 24, have the highest rates of being a victim of crime. Now, if we bring an ethnicity to that, our BAME individuals in the BAME community are more likely than white British to be victims of crime. But we know that women are at a higher likelihood of being victims of sexual assault, sexual crime. But in general, it's young men in the BAME community who are likely to be victims of crime. People who go out at night, that nighttime economy, consume alcohol, are also more likely. Poorer, working class areas have higher rates of crime. And those with mental health problems, disabilities, are also at a higher risk. Now, that key word is really important, risk. We're not saying that everybody who is young, black, and a man is going to be a victim of crime, but from our statistics, from this crime survey, from victim surveys, it shows that they are at a higher likelihood of being a victim of crime. Two new key terms is victim proneness. People become victims because of their own characteristics, again, instantly victim blame, and victim precipitation. So somebody who has been killed or injured may have started the violence. Now, already I'm hoping you're thinking, these two things are really hard to measure. Certain characteristics making people easy targets. What does that mean? What are those characteristics? As well as knowing that somebody who may have died as a response of a crime has started the violence. Unless we've got video footage of that, it's really hard to actually criminalise or do anything with that information. So we've got research here from the 50s. It's very outdated. That's what I want you to do, is try and find a more recent crime where the victims played a role. Again, it is very victim blaming for AO3. Can we find a case where this has taken place? Wolfgang in the 50s, a study of 588 homicides in Philadelphia in America, so deaths in America. 26% involved victim precipitation, so the victim triggering an event, so being the first to use violence or initiate something which ultimately led to their death or them being seriously injured. But like I've just said, this is so blaming, victim precipitation. And also, this is quite an interesting one. Without a victim, there would not be certain crimes like theft. So ultimately, crime will take place regardless, but certain crimes, there's a victim that is going to be on the, the bad end of that offence, essentially. So get some AO2 for this. How can we find something more modern? And then in terms of valuation, we spoke about it already. The positives of this positivist victimology is that it has been really important. It has given us some really good data that we can then help our survivors, help our victims of certain offences, such as sexual assault, has been important in highlighting how much this is happening in society and how we need to do more to tackle these offences. We need to do more to prevent, more to support. Some would say it's argued or it's highlighted the tendency for the criminal justice system to ignore victims. I think more needs to be done on education in terms of the police, in terms of how comfortable people feel in talking about certain offences. I mean, I watched a really good show on iPlayer called May I Destroy You? Oh no, I May Destroy You. And it stuck with me because it was so brilliantly done and true to life. So it was talking about this young woman who was date raped, and she can't really remember what happened, and it's sort of piecing that together. But she eventually, something triggers her trauma into the forefront of her mind, and she remembers everything really clearly. And it's kind of how she deals with that, and going to the police and having therapy, and it's really interesting. But the bit that stuck with me the most was her best friend is a gay man, and he is brutally raped. And it's a really horrendous viewing to watch. But he goes to the police, and he's sort of shoved in a room. No one really, the police officers they're dipping in and out because they're so busy. And then he doesn't feel comfortable. He doesn't say anything's happened. Because there's no relationship building there. There's no trust. It doesn't feel like he can talk about it. So the positivist approach here has highlighted how it does ignore victims, and we need to be doing more to support those who have been victims of crime. The issue, it does rely on self-report. It does rely on those victimization studies. There is some tend to blame. We know from our surveys that there are a limited amount of crimes that are talked about and considered. There's nothing on state or white collar or corporate crime in those surveys. Marxists would say because they are created by the rich. So they're not going to want people to say, oh, the state have done this, the state have done that. So it makes it really hard to actually generalise to all crimes. Then the idea of this victim precipitation carries the risks that the victim will not just be seen as involved, but for causing. So if we think to, in the 90s, when we were looking at rape cases in the media, and, in trial, the first thing, or one of the first things they would ask is, what were you wearing? And so we have to be very careful with certain crimes that we aren't placing the blame on the victims of crime. Like, I've just watched the most horrendous thing on Channel 4. It's called Consent. And we're actually talking about showing it to year 12 and 13. In a really posh school, there's a party. Some really horrible group of boys who just, really, really horrible. And this girl is really, really drunk. And the guy she really likes films himself having sex with her. And it all, the boys back him, and he posts this video in their chat, and they're laughing about it. And then there's this one boy who actually stands up and he sends the video to the girl. And from that moment, she's believed. Because all the the school, oh, you're an amazing student, they're all supporting him, and he's very wealthy. And the girl ends up leaving because no one's listening to her, no one's believing her. So we have to be careful that we aren't placing that responsibility on our victim. Okay, so we looked at positivist victimology. Secondly is radical victimology. So they suggest that more account needs to be taken of the structural factors in understanding victimization. So this is very much a left realist approach, talking about the causes of becoming a victim, the causes that are deep rooted in society that make certain people more likely to be a victim. So we're expecting to see things here like working class, where people live. If you live in a poorer area, you're more likely to be a victim of crime. Looking at a victim survey here in the 80s, individuals who are poor are often subject to repeat victimization. They don't have insurance, car insurance, home insurance, a way of protecting themselves. The police and the relationship they have with authority is dodgy anyway. So hard to report a crime, don't feel comfortable reporting a crime. So our radical victimologists are saying that we need to take into account the victims of crime other than street crime. Because street crime is really easy to convict because police are generally monitoring working class areas. We know that. So we need to look at other types of crime, especially state crime. So the victims of state crime are often poor and vulnerable. They are not going to go against the state and say, well, I always think of Erin Brockovich when I do this. It's a great film on Netflix where she's trying to sue a major company for polluting streams and rivers because it makes people really, really ill. And children getting cancer and things like that. So the poor in society don't ever feel they can stand up to big corporations because there's little compensation. There's a small chance that they will get anything from the state. Just put them in debt. Again, though, radical victimology is criticised because of the use of our crime surveys. They don't go out to everybody, they don't account for all crime, and they're self-report. Okay, lastly, so we've got positivist, radical, and critical victimology. Now, critical victimology questions the whole category of the victim. And they say the rich, the powerful, and the state have a crucial role in defining who is and isn't a victim. So our rich in society who make our laws, who make our rules, they will ultimately decide if you are a victim of crime. So it argues victims should not just be seen as passive recipients of crime, but more positively as somebody with individual rights that we should honour. And their focus is more on how their rights have been violated by the powerful. So you could argue the abortion law in America. Some feminists would be like, well, women are seen as victims of their own body. If you have been assaulted and you become pregnant, there's no way of getting an abortion. That's your rights being violated by the people who have made the law. That means you can't get an abortion. Tombs and White emphasise that many people are victims of corporate crime. More than a third of the US population have been victims of fraud. More than 20,000 people in the UK have been killed by air pollution. So we might be victims of corporate crime without even really knowing it. So the issue comes down to, are the public the victim? Are we the victims of a conservative ideology that's promoting certain things in our country? Is everybody a victim? Very philosophical. So from this view, our victim surveys don't do anything in explaining victimhood because people aren't aware that they are victims of crime. I hope that makes sense. And so, I've given you 2 questions here, 2 10 markers, item A and item B. I would like to see a plan for either of these. This is based on everything we've covered, not just victimology, but punishments, control of crime, crime prevention, that whole section. So I would pick one of these, answer it, plan it, and I'd like to see that.